What Japan called tradition, the girls called torture. For over 3 centuries, Japan's okiya, geisha houses, operated as legal factories where girls as young as 6 were purchased, renamed, and subjected to brutal conditioning methods designed to erase their identities. The women who ran these houses, the okasan, weren't simply strict teachers. They were architects of calculated cruelty, employing techniques that included physical torture, psychological manipulation, and economic imprisonment. And the most disturbing aspect? These same women had once been the broken children themselves, perpetuating a cycle of abuse masked as cultural tradition. Here's a question for you. Have you ever had to smile through real pain? To perform happiness while suffering? Comment below, because what happened in these houses reveals something universal about how society treats young girls. Let's examine exactly what took place behind those wooden walls in Gion. Kyoto, 1923. A city still smelling of rain and ink, where the lantern light on the narrow alleys pooled like questions no one wanted to answer. A thing that should have been private trembled into the open. A ledger, damp at the edges, with a list of names and prices that read more like a shipping manifest than a record of learning. The sound of geta on wet wood was ordinary, but beneath it a quieter sound persisted, the small breathing of girls who had been taught to be silent. In a dim room behind a tea house, an oiled comb clattered to the floor and did not belong to any story anyone in public was willing to tell. Hana pressed her palm to the cold lacquer as if the object could anchor a memory that had been loosened by fear. What this ledger showed was not merely cruelty in private rooms. It revealed a system designed to turn training into transaction and identity into inventory. The pages of that ledger would not have been found if not for the archivist, who refused to file it away. Here on Hidden Archives, we follow that promise. We open the manuscripts and ledgers that institutions preferred to forget. Every view helps pull a voice back from a place the record tried to bury. Now, step back with me toward the tea house door, because the room with the ledger is still warm and the candle has not yet guttered. The question is not whether you can hear what follows, it is whether you are willing to listen. The wider world that allowed those ledgers to exist had its own logic and authority. In the wake of wars and earthquakes, social systems tightened like belts around fragile communities. Bureaucrats and suzerains, men who held formal legal standing and informal moral weight, made choices that reshaped private rights into public economies. Municipal ordinances about performance licenses and apprenticeship contracts looked sensible on paper, but hid rules that made children movable assets. Elite families and government officials argued that tea houses were part of a civic economy, and that apprenticeship was a form of social uplift. At the same time, a new market for tourist spectacle created incentives to accelerate training and reduce costs. Local chroniclers praised cultural preservation, while ledgers in private rooms quantified the girls who were sent away for discipline or sale. The result was a bifurcated system where honor and commerce shared the same vocabulary but not the same conscience. Legal papers used words like contract and guardianship. Financial ledgers used words like deduction and payment. The girls who moved through this system became entries in both types of records. When historians later looked back at that period, they found statutes and proclamations that on the surface protected youth and craft. Closer to the living rooms and back rooms of tea houses, decisions were driven by scarcity and by a desire to contain scandal. In minutes from civic meetings, there were references to preserving social order and to preventing public scandal. In ledgers, there were entries that read as if they were balancing a ship manifest. The balance of civic rhetoric and private accounting is what permitted practices to become normalized. What those documents did not record were the small resistances the girls left behind in the margins, the folded scraps of testimony hidden inside a kimono, the shorthand note tucked in an old manuscript. Those marginalia are what pulled the archivist toward the room with the cold lacquered comb. The logic that enabled abuse was not random. It was designed as a mechanism of erasure. Those who profited called it regulation and discipline. Officials insisted on certificates and receipts as proof of propriety. Masters argued that strict control was necessary to produce excellence and to preserve the art. But behind these justifications sat policies which we can name now: the commodification of apprenticeship, the cataloging of bodies as inventory, the deliberate removal of names to avoid liability. There is a recorded memo in a regional ledger from a tea house proprietor recommending that apprentices be listed by number in ledgers and that identifying details be removed from public records. The memo advised that contracts be signed by proxies and that payments for transference be described as repayment of apprenticeship debt. A transcript from a municipal archive shows a registrar instructing fellows to accept sealed attestations rather than testimony in person. In effect, the system allowed evasion. It turned testimony into a paper trail that could be rerouted, and it made silence administratively simple. This was not mere neglect. It was a bureaucratic strategy that made the disappearance of a person's story bureaucratically invisible. It was calculated enough that it left the faintest traces for those who knew where to look. An indentation where a name had been scraped off an inventory, an erased number in a ledger, a folded scrap in the seam of a kimono. Those small traces became the case that would later draw a small team of researchers and an obstinate archivist into an excavation of memory. Two protagonists would carry this story, one a voice from the past and one from the present. Hana, the apprentice, was the first voice. She had once been catalogued as an entry, and she later became a testimony. Her backstory is a slow unwrapping. She was born on the outskirts of a fishing village, the daughter of a man who mended nets and a mother who sold pickled plums. As a child, she learned to listen to the sea and to read the sky by the way gulls arrange themselves. At 10, she was sent to the city to learn needlework and song with the hope of a stable life. The tea house where she was apprenticed promised shelter, a path to respectability, and room to learn a refined craft. The first seasons she learned posture and pitch and the names of flowers in the language of performance. She learned to fold her hands like paper cranes to make space in a world that pushed at the edges of her. She fell in love with a line of an old song that named the moon and the seam of the world with equal tenderness. But as seasons passed, she noticed rules that did not belong to artistry. Masters spoke of debts and of transfers as inevitabilities. When a storm of gossip threatened the house, younger apprentices were moved to a different district and their names were replaced in ledgers by people listed as dependents. Hana noticed the comb cold on the floor after a night when an elder master had insisted she practice until her palms bled. She hid a scrap of a note beneath layers of kimono where it waited like a seed of testimony. Her backstory holds images of salt on her collarbone, the smell of steamed rice and tallow at dawn, the coarse feel of apprenticeship sleeves, and the voice of a woman who once whispered that a song could be a life. It is important that her early life is shown not as poverty exploited, but as a complex set of loyalties and talents that were later bent into service for a ledger. The second protagonist is the archivist Nakamura, a careful man trained in paleography and municipal record-keeping who became the instrument of memory recovery. His backstory is shaped by obsession and loss. He grew up in a household of books, his father a minor official who kept ledgers and minutes in perfect order. Nakamura learned to read marginalia and to smell the glue in old manuscripts. When he was a young clerk, he found a prayer folded inside a municipal ordinance, and it haunted him because it suggested a human life behind bureaucratic language. He moved to the archive and taught himself to use ultraviolet light to reveal erased ink and to layer paper fragments to reconstruct torn pages. He lost his wife to influenza, and in the years after her death, he sought solace in assembling fragments into something whole. He kept a small ritual of lighting a single clove in winter to remember that the past could be smelled. When a descendant of a tea house keeper brought a damp bundle to the archive, Nakamura did what archivists are taught not to do. He touched it with his hands, and his fingers left the first order of curiosity. He opened the ledger and found the list of names. His decision to keep that page out of circulation and to investigate the ink led to the excavation. The dent in the paper, where a name had been erased, became a clue. His backstory explains why he would risk reputation to call a team of historians, and why he would later testify in a public hearing. Each protagonist carries a private ritual and a set of griefs that made them both vulnerable and persistent. The shock came one season when inspectors arrived at dawn. The tea house doors were shut, but a crowd had gathered by the alley, lanterns bobbing like fireflies. A notice had been pinned to the wall suggesting inspection for improper apprenticeships. The masters argued that the visit was a misunderstanding. The inspectors opened cupboards and counted kimonos and tallied receipts. They read aloud entries from ledgers. The sound of their reading was precise and mechanical, and it stripped language of its warmth. On that morning, a young girl called Yumi tried to speak, but was hushed by an older woman named Madame Sora, who folded her hand over the girl's mouth as if a hand could prevent history from leaking. The first blow was administrative, and yet it felt like breaking glass. A master, Master Kaito, muttered at the inspectors and insisted that behavior had been exemplary, and that all apprentices had guardians. The inventory was cited as proof. The ledger was used as both weapon and shield. For the apprentices, the moment crystallized into a single image, the door closing on their faces in a corridor of tatami, and the ledger being slid across a table like a verdict. The initial attack was not a single violent moment, but a grinding procedural certainty that turned people into records. What followed was a process the masters called discipline, and the apprentices called captivity. Girls were moved to training houses tucked away from public routes. They were told they were being protected or corrected. Some were promised eventual recognition, others faced an ambiguous fate called transfer, which could mean relocation, exile, or sale. The march was not always public. It happened at night, in the shuffle of floorboards, in carts with canvas covers, the weight of rice sacks in the same conveyance as soft bundles of clothing. There are testimonies of small resistances, a girl loosening a knot, a craftsman named Ryu hiding a hairpin in a seam, an older maid called Keiko slipping a note into a pocket. Dialogue during this period, recorded verbatim, reads like this in translation, where voices tremor and steadiness alternate, and there are 5 exchanges that tell the shape of the cruelty. The first exchange took place between Hana and Master Kaito. Hana said, "What will happen to us now?" Kaito said, "You will learn what is necessary." Hana said, "It feels like a sale." Kaito said, "It is repayment of debt and discipline." Hana said, "I am not a ledger entry." Kaito said, "The world will call what we do training." The second exchange was between Hana and Yumi in a dim room. Yumi said, "They counted names tonight." Hana said, "Did they write your real name?" Yumi said, "No, they wrote a number." Hana said, "How can they do that?" Yumi said, "They have ink and excuses." Hana said, "Then we must keep our names in other ways." The third exchange was between Nakamura and Keiko when he asked how many were missing. Keiko said, "We count in whispers." Nakamura said, "Show me where the seams are." Keiko said, "The seams hide more than thread." Nakamura said, "Then I will pull at them." Each exchange shows a mixture of fear, resistance, human tenderness, and bureaucratic dismissal. The method of control employed, humiliation, secrecy, and the appearance of legality. The transport continued until the group reached the municipal edge, where the capital's bustle thickened. The arrival in the main city created a different dynamic. People in the streets glanced at a group of disciplined trainees and then looked away, as if politeness could be moral. A public demonstration was improvised by a craftsman named Ito and a chronicler named Teru, who had been tracking transfers and who read aloud from a recovered manuscript regarding apprenticeship rights. The spectacle forced masters to perform propriety in public. Some members of the elite voiced concern, not for the girls, but for the reputation of the art. Meanwhile, the apprentices were paraded past a dome of the cultural society, as if their presence validated the institution. For the crowd, the image was striking. The girls, folded like origami, the lacquer combs, a small glint of private life. The surprise was that civic institutions, which had condoned the ledger, now had to answer to public scrutiny. In front of the dome, the inspectors demanded the original ledgers, and Master Kaito placed his hand on the book as if on a confession. The public pressure cracked the comfort of secrecy and created space for intervention. The discovery that would become the backbone of historical recovery was subterranean and material. Beneath a removed floorboard in a storage room dating to the late Meiji era, a chamber had been constructed, a small cavity where objects were placed and sealed. Inside were personal artifacts, a lacquer comb, a small prayer bead, a folded manuscript with a stitched edge, and an inscription scratched into wood with the tip of a hairpin. The inscription was simple, a line that in translation read, "I remember the names." The chamber smelled faintly of clove and old paper. An archaeologist named Dr. Aiko led the excavation. She brushed the manuscript with a soft camel hair brush and used a low suction to lift. The team applied conservation methods briefly described in their field notes. The manuscript was humidified in a controlled chamber and then layered between acid-free paper for stabilization, and ultraviolet imaging revealed erased ink strokes. The methodical description of their technique takes less than 300 characters, yet it mattered profoundly. The restoration allowed reading of what had been scored out. The recovered objects were evidence, both intimate and administrative. The manuscript contained a list of names with annotations, and small carved notations that matched indentations in a municipal ledger. The inscription in the chamber showed intentional preservation, a conscious act by someone inside the house who wanted memory to survive, even if official ink erased it. Interdisciplinary consultation followed. Conservators compared stitching patterns, historians cross-referenced municipal ledgers, linguists analyzed language use, and a diplomat with archival experience helped to obtain permissions to access a private collection of ledgers. The combination of material evidence and bureaucratic records created a bridge between private testimony and public administration. When the evidence was presented in a hearing, the account became public, and the voices could no longer be contained in ledgers. Testimony from survivors and statements from the archivist were juxtaposed with the manuscript and the chamber objects. A criminal counsel questioned the chain of custody, and an old suzerain's nephew argued for cultural exception. Some public figures tried to diminish what had happened by calling it training irregularity. There were moments of tension. A small man from the Chamber of Commerce, Lord Tanaka, rose and tried to argue that these were isolated incidents and that the art required strictness. In that hearing, a woman named Mariko, who had once been a maid, spoke with quiet force, and the room stilled. The moral pressure led to official inquiries, an internal review, and the start of restitution efforts. Two critical moments of tension were central. The first was the public cross-examination, where the masters attempted to recast every account as misinterpretation. For 5 paragraphs, the record shows the flicker between denial and procedural quibbling and the feeling of clawing at truth. The second moment was personal, when Hana was asked to identify a comb. She did so, and the comb fit a curve in her hair and a memory of her mother's face. That memory collapsed the veneer of abstract debate and produced moral clarity. Those moments were small in words, but large in consequence. They shifted policymaking conversations from theoretical protection to concrete oversight. The epilogue plays out across months, and it is important to watch how memory enters public life. 1 month after the hearing, a community vigil was held outside the archive. Hundreds gathered with paper lanterns, and the lacquer comb was displayed beneath a cloth. People read names aloud, a ritual of naming that reclaimed what ledgers had tried to erase. Local papers carried essays that questioned municipal practices, and a coalition of tea houses agreed to open records for inspection. 3 months later, a formal inquiry published recommendations for apprenticeship oversight. The manuscript and chamber objects were cataloged in a national archive and made accessible to scholars. Nakamura was given a modest honor and invited to contribute to a national manuscript registry. Survivors were offered counseling and small reparations, though many called that insufficient. An educational program began in schools using the recovered manuscript to teach about rights and the ethics of cultural preservation. 6 months on, the cultural conversation had shifted. Laws were debated that would require transparent ledgers and guardianship checks. The debate was not simple. Some argued that tourism and cultural performance needed protection and feared that regulation would stifle tradition. Others argued that tradition without accountability is cruelty when it is cloaked in artistic vocabulary. In public forums, a craftsman named Ryu and a teacher named Emiko spoke about how apprenticeship could be restructured with consent and with documented oversight. The manuscript that had been hidden in the chamber now hung in an exhibit with placards describing conservation techniques, and the line "I remember the names" was highlighted as a moral injunction. The epilogue is not tidy, but it is active. There were changes, small and structural, new archival practices, a continuing campaign to reunite families, and a slow cultural shift toward recognizing that art cannot be separated from the dignity of its practitioners. What this ledger and this chamber teach is not only about a particular place and time, but about the way systems convert people into entries when accountability is lax. The lines scratched into wood and the damp ink on a manuscript show how resistance can survive in small acts of preservation. The archive is not neutral. It is where memory and power intersect. In a world that still produces official ledgers and private rooms, we must ask who maintains the ledgers and who opens the chambers. If this story left you with a feeling of indignation or of responsibility, you are in the company of those who believe that remembering is an active practice. The comb that Hana touched is now in a public collection, and it invites you to look not away, but closer. If you want more stories like this, if you want to see the manuscripts and the ledgers, and the technical work that restores erased ink, subscribe and help keep these voices in light. The lesson is simple and moral, and hard to forget. The names we speak make resistance visible, and the memory we preserve becomes a law against erasure. The comb remains a small bright thing. The names remain. The light that remembers is still on.